The next speaker in this session is Philip Townsend. So Philip is a senior economist at the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences, and Philip's recent work is on identifying and quantifying the barriers and drivers to native vegetation management on farmland by exploring the role of legislation and market-based instruments in guiding these decisions. So again, looking at the multiple instruments that are used here.
It's an opportunity to talk today about some of the preliminary results out of a project we're undertaking at the present time. So as we go through and to give you an outline of the results today, just to let you know that these are the actual responses from people as part of our survey and case study work. Through the Bureau, what we do is we take the respondent answers and we turn this into national information about what are farmers' attitudes, intentions, perceptions, views, activities. So for today, the information I'll provide you is what's coming through from the respondents. So in terms of the market-based instruments, while they're one component in the overall policy mix for achieving outcomes with natural resource management, there are questions around how effective they might be and how they're working. As we've been going around the country talking to landholders and people trying to deliver these programs, we've come up with some of the challenges for people who are trying to think through how they're going to plan changes in practice on their farms. So things they've been telling us is one of the challenges for them is the short-term availability. So if they want to plan changes across time, they can't do them all at once. But these programs or market-based instruments where they're going to have to tender for funding appear then disappear, and it doesn't fit then with a plan or approach they might have in mind. Access to market information. There's little information about the prices for these environmental services and activities, and they really struggle to come up with the estimates for bid prices. This seems to take more than any time. It takes more time than anything else in putting the applications together, and they really struggle to find people who might be able to guide them. Relevant units. There's no units that farmers can grasp as to what governments are trying to achieve in terms of using either market-based instruments or legislation to achieve environmental outcomes on farms. And the rapidly changing objectives and purpose means they're unsure what governments are trying to achieve and therefore what role they play. So we've been trying to understand some of these landholders' current activities and what their future intentions are with respect to managing natural resources, and therefore how this might fit into the design of both market-based instruments, the regulatory framework, and then how it will relate to extension services, role of the private sector in filling some of the gaps. So the current project is a bit larger than just looking at market-based instruments. We're looking at the barriers and drivers of native vegetation management on farmland. It's funded through Caring for Our Country and it's managed through DAF. The objectives of the program are to try and understand what are the drivers of native vegetation management on farmland, what are landholders' current attitudes, views and perceptions towards existing policies and programs, and what are their current activities. So the outcomes are to propose approaches that use combinations of these tools to achieve the outcomes governments are seeking. And there's a real difference in the language about from the policy side to the farmer's interpretation or inability to understand what governments are seeking to achieve. I can take a little bit of credit for what's here. There's two very good progressive pieces of work. On the left-hand side, many of you would have seen David Pannell's work about when is it most efficient and effective to use the different policy instruments that are available to us, the positive incentives, negative incentives, regulatory forms, market-based instruments that are definitely in that group, extension, planning and R&D investment. On the right-hand side is a summary of the work going on at UNE at the present time, looking at farmers' motivations. And so the ecocentric people are those who put the environment and its management either equivalent to or ahead of production outcomes on farms. The anthropogenic group, the one in the middle, they will make changes to their practice if there's a price signal to do so. And the bottom group is the environmentally apathetic. They're not interested in making changes to their current production processes. A little bit of the we're doing is actually in between these two areas of progressive thought. Which instruments are best targeted to different farmer groups based on their motivations? through our survey work, we're able to actually pick up some of the pathways through this. So we're able to pick up through the survey respondents who are the ecocentric. And for example, these are people who are identified that have the native vegetation on their farm is in good or excellent condition, but they are looking to increase the area and or improve its condition. The environmentally apathetic, they've identified that the native vegetation condition on their farm is in either poor or medium condition, but have no intention to improve practices in relation to native vegetation. Part of the project is to test a whole range of perceptions and claims that have been raised about what's happening with native vegetation management on farms and the implications for the regulatory processes and the incentive framework. What are landholders' current uses of native vegetation? How much are they looking to clear or develop, otherwise modify? How much are they actually intending to improve the condition or extent of that native vegetation? What's the effect of the regulatory framework on their actions and management decisions? Are the programs currently suitable to what landholders need? And what is the role of the other policy levers? How do they all fit together in this big box of policy measures? And then there's the private sector facilitation, where there's potential for selling some of these environmental services to non-farmer groups. We're looking at different development activities. The four elements to the project. So we've got a national stratified survey. So this lets us take information from 1,000 respondents and transfer it into a picture of what's happening nationally. The advantage for us is we most probably have 300 plus data points for each landholder. We have information about all of their production activities, their drivers of practice change, what they're doing with their native vegetation. We understand a whole range of characteristics about their on-farm activities. So we have the capacity to answer a number of the questions about what's driving their practices change, how important their financial position is to these changes that they may make in the future. And I'll give you an outline of some of the questions we're able to address. But for example, one of the important ones we're looking at is what role does native vegetation play as a factor of production on farms? It's completely left out of the economic analysis so far. Most people have looked at capital and labour, materials and services, but no one's considered the role of native vegetation, how important that is as a factor of production, and how might the top performing farmers use native vegetation as opposed to the middle 50% or the bottom 25% of farmers. Indications to us are people are picking up large private benefits out of improving their management of native vegetation. We're looking at the legislation, so it's not a review of legislation. We're providing summaries of how the legislation works and what are some of the challenges within that legislative framework. And that'll be overall. The structure of and implementation of market-based instruments, role of extension, use of tax laws and other components in the policy mix. 2 case studies. One I won't get to talk about, I won't get to talk about either of them too much today. Looking at what are the transaction costs for both landholders and governments to be involved in these processes. They're quite significant. And we're looking at them at 4 levels for the transaction costs themselves as to what might be involved in putting in a clearing application, looking at some form of formal agreement, such as through a stewardship program or other funding that they might obtain, or just having an agreement within the farm, just to themselves, to manage and meet particular environmental objectives. And then there's certain costs, transaction costs associated with covenanting. The second case study is to investigate the costs and benefits of options to enhance the trading of environmental services between landholders. At the moment, it's government to landholder, or it's a landholder to a non-farmer. And what about this other group? What role might it play? What might be some of the benefits associated with looking at potential for farmer-to-farmer trading of environmental services? So from the survey itself, approximately 50% of farmers have a farm plan. And that mightn't sound anything too great. Last time we did this was in about 2003-04. We had 15% of farmers with a farm plan. 73% of these farm plans include native vegetation protection, active management and rehabilitation. In terms of on-farm native vegetation management, 84% of respondents say they're managing native vegetation on their farm for environmental and production outcomes. 29% are considering how they manage native vegetation relative to landscape outcomes. Now that's actually larger than the proportion of farmers who are thinking about native vegetation management on their neighbouring farms. Farmers are seeking recognition for what they're currently doing. They can't see any process that this is flowing through as to what they're doing with their native vegetation. 75% believe the native vegetation is in good or excellent condition. And we've got ways to test that. So we're going to look at correlating that information against what's called the VAST data set. So it's the vegetation, state and transition data. But it may give an indication as to why some farmers may not be interested in market-based instruments. They already believe it's in really good shape and they don't need to do any more. 13% of farmers are managing their native vegetation under some form of formal agreement. That is, they've got a commitment off the farm to meet some particular outcome over time. 64, so almost two-thirds, are managing it to meet their own requirements, their own environmental objectives that they've set on the farm. Landholders' intentions. Previous surveys, again from the middle 2000s from ABARES, we had around 25% of farmers in the rangelands in New South Wales and 45% from the rangelands in Queensland were looking to develop native vegetation by clearing. We've got 9% of respondents now looking at options for clearing, thinning or otherwise modifying native vegetation. 18% are wanting to increase the area, 29% want to improve the condition. Now there's combinations there where some landholders are doing multiples of those first three, but there's 58% who don't want to make any changes to what they're currently doing. They don't believe there's any need. For those not increasing the area or improving the condition, they say they're managing for environmental outcomes, but there's around a quarter who think it's not financially worthwhile. And 18% say the programs are too complex to go down the pathway of applying and seeking funding or being part of the market-based instruments. In terms of looking at market-based instruments for native vegetation, we've looked at programs right across the country in terms of how they're currently operating. Essentially, we've got input-based programs where there's money available for fencing, watering points, etc., stewardship and covenanting work. Essentially, they're all market-based instruments because people are putting in bids for funding. They're tendering on some basis. But major challenges, as I was saying, calculating the bid price. When people are looking at market-based instruments, you've got those who are looking at additional outcomes. You've also got those who are not going to make any changes in practice, but can access the funding. They've been told, they've been sought out even by the delivery agents to put in bids to these programs. Game theory comes into play. Farmers have got little idea because of the lack of market information out there about how to actually build this bid component. They really struggle. It takes more time than anything. And to get a feeling for how challenging this is, some farmers have actually, when we've spoken about the contents of their agreements, they didn't know what in perpetuity meant. So putting together a bid price was an even bigger challenge for them to understand, well, we got this contract, we didn't know what it meant. We thought in perpetuity just meant somebody couldn't take my land under native title, but we can change it later, can't we? So it's a whole range of questions where people out there aren't really understanding what it is they're signing up to. There's a strong reliance on extension support. They really rely on the extension officers that they can talk to and access to gather information on these activities. And as I mentioned before, it's difficult to plan how they will put in place a series of changes because programs disappear. Right. And the lack of price signals makes it quite difficult for them. The weights aren't clear. So what are the objectives? What are the priorities? So when they put together a bid price, they're thinking about, okay, game theory, yeah, I might put in this, that's my cost, but my neighbours might, bit of lower price, what might I be up against? What are the challenges here in understanding the different weights and measures that are put into these metric tools? It's not clear, it's not transparent to them. Interesting, when we asked them about whether or not they applied for funding for native vegetation management between 2005 and 2010, 29% of the survey respondents had applied. And the proportions are consistent across the agricultural sector, so cropping, grazing, mixed farming as in cropping and grazing and dairy. Proportions similar. 84% of those who applied for funding received funding from at least one program. But farm size was not a significant determinant. So some people have raised the point that maybe it's smaller farms who are applying. Maybe there's some farm bias. There actually doesn't appear to be any difference in the size of the farms applying. If anything, it might be a little bit biased towards larger farms. Reasons why only 29% of the farmers are applying could be a consequence of the program design and delivery mechanisms that are available. Program delivery people generally have something like a year to advertise, get it out there, get people putting in an expression of interest, go out, assess the property, gather together the data, come up with an agreement through some form of negotiated process, get funding out the door. And it's a real challenge to get to more landholders than are currently engaged through a lot of the delivery agents' activities. Maybe the MBIs are operating in particular regions. So part of what we're able to do is map where these activities are going on. So the red is less than 5% of the respondents. These are based on our broadacre farming zones that we use within ABARES. The red's less than 5%. The orange is 5 to 20% of farmers have applied. Light green is 20 to 35, and the dark green is greater than 35% of respondents have applied for funding. So we can get a breakdown of where people are applying for the programs. So landholders' non-participation in the market-based instruments. 25% weren't aware that they were available. 21% thought the applications were too complex. 12% thought the process was too time-consuming. 43% had other reasons. And half of those thought there was no need or they just want to do it themselves. Landholder perceptions of program effectiveness. 12% thought they were fully effective. 38% partially effective. 27% ineffective. Now, what is interesting is people who thought they were fully effective also mapped quite closely to their views about legislation. Those who thought it was fully effective thought legislation was acceptable. Those who thought the programs were ineffective thought there were major problems with the legislation. So there's commonalities in the way they're thinking about native vegetation. Reasons limiting landholder participation in market-based instruments. The perception of condition. They believe their native vegetation is in good condition. Well, we've got to test that against some other data that we have available to us. Maybe it comes down to having the capacity to monitor the current condition and state of their native vegetation and how it's changing across time. If they had the capacity to monitor, they could pick up whether or not it is in good or excellent condition, therefore what practices they might be considering for future adoption, and therefore how important market-based instruments might be to them in facilitating those sorts of outcomes. The delivery of the programs is quite difficult, or engagement with extension officers. It's largely one-to-one. And so part of our work with people at UNE, we're going to look at what it might be the next generation governance tools for greater interaction with landholders and how we target interaction with landholders around the different instruments. Just do the conclusions and be done in time. So conclusions we've been able to draw so far out of our analysis. Defining the target groups that might be best suited to market-based instruments. The ecocentric are already changing practices because they're getting considerable private benefits out of managing their native vegetation in an improved way. There's a question there about whether or not market-based instruments should be targeted to those people or not. The anthropocentric, they will change with a relevant price signal. Okay, what's the best way to get to this group of farmers? What's the best structure for the market-based instruments? The provision of information about what it's worth. And for the apathetic, well, they're unlikely to be interested, and maybe the negative incentives are the reason that those things are in place. Long-term availability of market-based instruments are required to provide a better understanding amongst landholders of the structure, the institutional structures that sit around these activities, how they operate, how important monitoring is, how they might evolve their practices over time. Improving the market transparency would be a really important element, but I know how difficult this is as well. We've got to come up with units. If you're going to have a market, you've got to have units to trade. Landholders can't see them. Target the extension to provide monitoring support. This could be one of the most effective tools for helping farmers with the managing and improving the condition of the native vegetation on farms. And designing the market-based instruments to facilitate the exchange of environmental services between landholders could be an important contribution that complements the regulatory framework. Considering what options might be available to improve the flexibilities within our current legislative framework could be quite important. Finally, I'd just like to thank some of the people in this room, and there's a lot of people outside, giving us advice and guidance, and particularly access to a whole range of stakeholders. Wouldn't be possible to do the project without a lot of help from a lot of people. So I just want to acknowledge all the support we've been given around the country and from various stakeholders. Thank you.